"We need to talk about the house," my daughter-in-law said softly, as if she were asking about the weather, not my life, not my home, not the man lying just a few feet away in a polished mahogany coffin. I stood there in my black dress, my gloved hands resting lightly against each other, staring at the flowers arranged so carefully around Robert's body. White lilies. He always said they smelled like peace. But there was no peace here. Not anymore. I didn't turn to look at her. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I kept my eyes on the silver handles of the coffin, tracing their shine under the soft church lights, pretending for just a moment that if I stayed still enough, quiet enough, this would all slow down. That this wouldn't be real. "Margaret," she added a little firmer this time, like she was reminding me of my place. Like I was someone who needed direction. I nodded once. Just once. That was all I gave her. Behind me, I could hear the low murmur of voices, the careful shuffle of shoes on polished wood, the distant hum of condolences that all sounded the same. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a wonderful man. If you need anything." But no one stepped in. No one told her to stop. Not even my son. I glanced at Daniel then, just for a second. He stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like he couldn't quite look at me anymore. 42 years. That's how long Robert and I had been married. 42 years of building something from nothing, of saving every dollar, of choosing this house together, of planting the oak tree in the front yard when Daniel was 5 years old. 42 years reduced to a conversation that couldn't even wait until after the service. Vanessa stepped closer. I could feel it without seeing her. The subtle shift in the air, the faint scent of her perfume, something expensive and sharp. "It's just that there are decisions to make," she continued, her voice still low, still controlled, as if she were doing me a favor. "The house is too big for you now. It doesn't make sense for you to stay there alone. Too big." I almost smiled at that. That house had never felt too big when Robert was alive. It had never felt empty when his voice filled the rooms, when his footsteps echoed down the hallway, when he'd call my name from the kitchen just to ask where I'd put the coffee filters. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't say anything at all. "We've been thinking," she added, and that word "we" landed heavier than anything else she'd said. "We." As if I wasn't part of that equation. As if my life could be rearranged without my consent. I finally turned then, slowly, meeting her eyes. She didn't look uncomfortable. Not even here. Not even now. If anything, she looked focused. Determined. Like this was just another task on her list to get through before the day was over. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, but he still didn't speak. Not a single word. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't grief talking. This had been discussed. Planned. Decided. Long before today. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something clearer. I adjusted my gloves, smoothing the fabric over my fingers, and let my gaze drift back to Robert. He had always said I underestimated people. That I chose to see the best in them, even when I shouldn't. Maybe he was right. Or maybe I had just been waiting for the moment when they would finally show me who they really were. And standing there, with the scent of lilies in the air and my husband's coffin between us, I realized that moment had finally come. I let Vanessa keep talking. I let her outline her plans, her timelines, her quiet little assumptions about what would happen next. Because if there was one thing Robert had taught me after all those years, it was this. You don't interrupt someone when they're revealing exactly who they are. You let them finish. And then you decide what to do with the truth. The service ended the way all services do, with quiet footsteps and softer voices, with people lining up to say things they believed were comforting, even if they were not, and I stood there beside Robert for as long as I could, long enough that my feet began to ache inside my black shoes, long enough that the scent of lilies became something I could no longer ignore, long enough that I realized no one was really looking at him anymore. They were looking at me, or rather, looking past me, as if I had already begun to disappear from the center of my own life, and when the final guest had shaken my hand and offered their carefully chosen words, I felt Vanessa step in again, not physically pushing me aside, but close enough that the intention was clear. And she leaned toward Daniel, not even bothering to lower her voice this time, and said, "We should speak with the attorney before everyone leaves. It is better to be efficient." Efficient, that was the word she chose, as if grief could be scheduled between appointments, as if a man's life could be wrapped up as neatly as the program they had handed out at the door, and Daniel nodded. Just a small movement, but enough to tell me that whatever conversation had already taken place between them was still continuing, uninterrupted by the reality of this day, and I watched them. From the corner of my eye as they moved a few steps away, their heads close together, their voices low but urgent, and I noticed the way Vanessa held a folder against her chest, something I had not seen earlier, something structured, prepared, and it struck me then that she had not come here just to mourn. She had come ready, and that realization did not sting the way I might have expected. It settled instead, like a quiet weight pressing down on something that had already begun to harden inside me, and I turned my attention back to the empty space where Robert's presence used to be, the absence louder now than any words spoken in the room, and I remembered a morning not so long ago when he had stood in our kitchen, sunlight coming through the window behind him, holding his coffee in that chipped mug he refused to replace, and he had looked at me in that steady way of his and said, "Margaret, people show you who they are when they think it matters most." And I had laughed then. Told him he was being dramatic, told him our family was not like that we had raised Daniel better, that love was enough to hold everything together, and he had just smiled, not arguing, not correcting me, just watching me with that same calm expression he wore when he knew something I did not, and standing there now, with the quiet echo of his voice still somewhere in my memory, I understood what he had meant, because this was the moment that mattered most, and they were not hiding anything, not even trying to, and that was what made it so clear, so undeniable. I walked slowly toward the exit, past the rows of empty chairs, past the scattered programs left behind, and I could feel Vanessa's eyes follow me for a second, calculating, measuring, but she did not stop me. She did not need to, in her mind. Everything was already moving in the direction she had planned, and outside, the air felt colder than it had that morning, a sharp breeze catching the edge of my coat, and I stood there for a moment, just breathing, just letting the quiet settle around me, when I heard footsteps behind me and a voice I recognized. "Mrs. Whitmore." I turned to see Harrison Cole approaching, his posture as composed as always, his expression unreadable but not indifferent, never indifferent, and he stopped a few feet away, giving me space, the kind of respect that does not need to be spoken, and he glanced briefly back toward the building before lowering his voice. "I imagine this is not the easiest day for conversations, but there are matters that should not be delayed." I studied his face for a moment, searching for something, a hint, a warning, anything that might explain the weight behind his words, and there it was, subtle but unmistakable, something beneath the surface, something he was not saying outright, and I felt that same quiet shift inside me again, that same clarity settling into place. "They're already discussing it, are they not?" I said, my voice calm, steadier than I felt, and he gave the smallest nod, just enough to confirm what I already knew. "Yes," he replied, "they are." There was a pause then, brief but intentional, and he added, "There is something your husband wanted you to understand, something he insisted remain confidential unless it became necessary." Necessary. The word lingered in the space between us, and for the first time since this day had begun, I felt something that was not grief, not shock, not even disappointment, but anticipation, quiet and controlled, and I looked back toward the doors of the chapel where Vanessa and Daniel still stood inside, still speaking in low voices, still planning a future they believed was already theirs, and I realized, with a calm certainty that surprised even me, that they had no idea what Robert had actually left behind, and more importantly, who he had left it for. I did not answer him right away, not because I did not understand what he was saying, but because I understood it too well, and there is a difference between hearing something and allowing it to settle into the part of you that knows it will change everything, and I was not ready to rush that moment. So I looked at Harrison Cole for a few seconds longer than necessary, studying the lines in his face, the careful way he chose his words, the way his hands remained still at his sides. A man who had spent decades watching families unravel over things they believed belonged to them, and I wondered how many times he had stood exactly like this, delivering the beginning of a truth that would not be welcomed. Robert did not leave things unprotected. He continued quietly, as if he were speaking into the wind rather than directly to me. He was very deliberate in how he structured everything. I let out a slow breath, the kind that does not show on the outside, but shifts something on the inside. Deliberate. That sounded like Robert. Careful, thoughtful, always a few steps ahead in ways I used to tease him about, and I nodded slightly, giving Harrison permission to continue without saying the words out loud. There is a clause, he said, pausing just long enough to make sure I was listening, truly listening, one that does not activate under normal circumstances. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the fabric of my gloves, a small movement, almost invisible, but enough for me to feel it. What kind of clause? I asked, my voice steady, even, as if we were discussing something routine, something ordinary, and not the quiet unraveling of everything my son and his wife believed they already controlled. Harrison glanced once more toward the chapel doors, then back at me, lowering his voice just enough that the words felt contained between us. A protective clause, he said, one tied to conduct, to intent, to how you are treated. The breeze picked up slightly, lifting a strand of my hair, and I did not move to fix it. I did not move at all. Your husband was very clear, he added. If at any point you were disrespected, dismissed, or pressured regarding the estate, the distribution would change. Change. The word echoed in my mind, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that made everything else fall into place. And suddenly, the conversation inside the chapel, the folder in Vanessa's hands, the way Daniel could not meet my eyes, it all aligned into something that was no longer confusing, no longer painful in the way it had been just an hour ago. It became something else, something I could see clearly, something I could understand. They have already crossed that line, have they not? I said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Harrison gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, he replied, they have. There was no hesitation in his voice. No uncertainty, just confirmation, and for the first time since Robert had been laid to rest, I felt a sense of stillness settle over me. Not the emptiness that comes with loss, but a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes when you finally understand the shape of what is happening around you. I turned my head slightly, looking back at the chapel doors again, and through the glass I could see them. Vanessa speaking with quiet intensity, her hand moving in small, controlled gestures. Daniel standing beside her, listening, nodding, following, and I realized something then that I had not allowed myself to fully accept before. My son was not confused. He was not caught in the middle. He had chosen his position, and that realization did not break me. It did not even surprise me as much as it should have. It simply settled into place, another piece of a puzzle that was finally complete. What happens now? I asked, and Harrison took a small step closer. Not enough to invade my space, but enough to make sure his next words reached me without interruption. That depends on you, he said. Your husband designed this so that you remain in control, but the clause must be acknowledged formally. Formally, of course. Robert would have made sure of that. Nothing left to chance, nothing left to interpretation. Everything documented, everything precise. I nodded again. Slower this time, letting the decision form fully before I spoke, because once I said it, there would be no turning back. Not that I wanted to. Then we will acknowledge it, I said, my voice quiet but firm, and Harrison's expression shifted just slightly, not into a smile, but into something close to approval, something that told me I was stepping into exactly the role Robert had intended for me. And as we turned toward the chapel doors together, I felt the weight of the day still there, the grief still present, but no longer overwhelming, no longer blinding, because beneath it, something else had taken root, something steady, something clear. And as I reached for the door handle, I realized that whatever Vanessa and Daniel believed they had already secured, whatever plans they had begun to make, they were about to learn that they had misunderstood one very important thing. None of this had ever been theirs to control. I pushed the door open slowly, the soft creak barely noticeable against the low hum of voices still lingering inside, and the moment I stepped back into the room, the air felt different. Not heavier, not colder, but sharper somehow, as if everything had shifted just slightly out of place, and Vanessa was the first to notice me. Of course she was, her eyes locking onto mine with that same focused expression she had worn all afternoon. Except now there was something else beneath it, something impatient, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold, and Daniel turned a second later, his posture straightening just enough to suggest awareness, not respect, and I walked toward them at a measured pace, each step steady, deliberate, the sound of my heels against the polished floor echoing softly in the quiet space, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection in the glass panel along the wall, a woman in black, composed, upright, not the image of someone who had just lost everything, but of someone who had begun to understand what had never truly been taken from her. Margaret, Vanessa said, her tone shifting quickly, softening just enough to appear considerate. We were just about to come find you. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without accepting them. I am sure you were, I replied, my voice calm, even, the kind of calm that does not invite interruption, and I noticed the folder still in her hands, held a little tighter now, as if its contents mattered more than anything else in the room. We thought it would be best to go over a few things while everyone is still here, she continued, glancing briefly at Daniel as if to reinforce her position, and he nodded again, that same small, practiced movement that said everything and nothing at the same time. It is just about being practical, she added. And there it was again, that word, practical, as if practicality could replace respect, as if timing did not matter, as if grief had no place in decisions that would reshape a life. I let a small pause settle between us before responding, not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to make sure my words would land exactly where they needed to. Then let us be practical, I said, and I saw the brief flicker of satisfaction cross her face, quick but unmistakable. Because in that moment, she believed I was agreeing with her, that I was stepping into the role she had already assigned to me, the quiet widow, the one who would be guided, advised, managed, and Daniel exhaled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if some tension he had been holding had just eased, and that was when Harrison stepped forward beside me, his presence subtle but undeniable, shifting the balance of the space without raising his voice, without making any grand announcement. Just by standing there. Mrs. Whitmore has requested that we proceed formally, he said, his tone professional, measured, and Vanessa's expression changed instantly, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else in the room might notice, but I saw it, the tightening around her eyes, the slight adjustment of her posture, the recalculation. Formally, she repeated, as if testing the word, as if trying to understand why it had suddenly entered the conversation. Yes, Harrison replied, there are specific provisions that must be acknowledged before any decisions regarding the estate can be discussed, and for the first time since this day had begun, Vanessa did not speak immediately. She looked at Daniel, searching, questioning, and he frowned slightly, confusion replacing the quiet confidence he had worn just moments before. What provisions? He asked, his voice lower now, less certain, and I watched them both carefully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that made everything else fall away. The ones your father put in place, I said, finally stepping fully into the space between them, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering, and Vanessa's grip on the folder tightened again, her knuckles whitening just slightly. We have already reviewed the will, she said quickly, too quickly, and there it was, the first crack, small but undeniable. Have you? Harrison responded, his tone unchanged, because the clause we are referring to is not one that reveals itself without cause, and the silence that followed was not long. But it was enough for the shift to become visible, enough for the certainty they had carried to begin to waver, and I felt it then, not as a surge, not as a victory, but as a quiet alignment of everything that had been set in motion long before this day, and I looked at my son, really looked at him, at the man he had become, at the choices he had made without ever speaking them aloud, and I realized that whatever came next would not be about convincing him. It would not be about reclaiming something lost. It would simply be about allowing the truth to stand where it had always been, waiting to be seen, and I folded my hands gently in front of me. the fabric of my gloves smooth beneath my fingers, and said, "I think it is time we all understand exactly what your father intended." The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something fragile beginning to crack under pressure, and I could see it in the way Vanessa straightened her shoulders, in the way Daniel's eyes moved between Harrison and me as if trying to catch up to a conversation he had assumed he already understood, and for a moment, no one spoke, which was exactly what Robert would have wanted. Space, time, just enough for people to reveal themselves without interruption, and Harrison took a measured breath before continuing. "Your husband included a conditional provision tied directly to Mrs. Whitmore's treatment following his passing," his voice calm, neutral, but each word placed with precision, and Vanessa's lips parted slightly, not in shock, not yet, but in calculation, already searching for a way to reframe what she was hearing. "I do not understand what that means," she said, her tone controlled, but there was a tightness underneath it now, something less certain than before, and Daniel shifted beside her, his brow furrowing. "Neither do I," he added, his voice quieter than usual, and I watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that felt almost detached, as if I were observing something that had already been decided long before any of us walked into this room. "It means," Harrison continued, "that the distribution of the estate is not fixed. It is dependent on conduct, specifically how Mrs. Whitmore is treated in matters concerning the estate and her place within it." And I saw it then, the first real break in Vanessa's composure, subtle, but unmistakable, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the folder, the way her gaze flickered for just a second before returning to Harrison. "That is highly unusual," she said, a little sharper now, as if labeling it that way might reduce its power, might make it something negotiable, something dismissible, but Harrison did not react, not even slightly. "It is uncommon," he agreed, "but entirely valid and fully enforceable," and Daniel exhaled, a short breath that seemed to carry more weight than he intended. "So what are you saying?" he asked, looking at me now, really looking at me for the first time since this day began, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not guilt, not yet, but uncertainty, and I met his gaze steadily, not softening, not hardening, just holding it long enough for him to understand that whatever answer came next would not be something he could ignore. "I am saying that your father made sure I would not be pushed aside," I replied, my voice even, my words simple, but each one deliberate, and Vanessa let out a small, controlled laugh, the kind that is meant to sound dismissive but lands just slightly off. "No one is pushing anyone aside," she said. Quickly, too quickly, and I tilted my head just slightly, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of what had already been shown without needing to be argued. "You began discussing the sale of my home before your father-in-law was even laid to rest," I said, and this time, there was no need to raise my voice, no need to emphasize the point, because the truth of it stood on its own, undeniable, and Daniel's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm what he would not say out loud, and Vanessa's expression hardened, not dramatically, but in a way that removed any remaining pretense of softness. "We were trying to be responsible," she said, her tone firmer now, more defensive than before. "There are practical considerations." And there it was again, that word, practical, repeated like a shield, like something that could justify timing, tone, intention, and I felt that same quiet steadiness settle deeper within me, not shaken, not challenged, simply present. "And there are respectful ones," I replied, and the space between us seemed to tighten just slightly, not with conflict, but with recognition, because this was no longer about interpretation. It was about what had already happened, what had already been said, what had already been revealed. And Harrison stepped in again, not to interrupt, but to anchor the moment. "Given the circumstances," he said, "the clause is now active, which means all decisions regarding the estate must be deferred until a formal review is conducted under Mrs. Whitmore's authority." And the words settled heavily, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that could not be softened or redirected, and Vanessa's grip on the folder loosened just slightly, as if the weight of it had shifted, as if it no longer held what she believed. It did, and Daniel looked between us again, slower this time, more carefully, as if trying to piece together something that no longer aligned with the assumptions he had been holding on to, and I stood there, my posture unchanged, my hands still, my voice quiet, because there was no need for anything else. The truth had already done what it needed to do, and as I watched them both, I realized that this was not the moment everything fell apart. This was the moment everything became clear. And clarity, I had learned, is far more powerful than any reaction. No one spoke for a few seconds after Harrison finished, and that silence felt different from the ones before. It was no longer polite or uncertain. It was heavy with realization, with a quiet understanding that something had shifted beyond their control, and I could see it most clearly in Daniel, in the way he ran his hand slowly along the back of his neck, a habit he had carried since he was a boy whenever something did not go the way he expected, and for a moment, I saw that version of him again, the child who used to look to me for answers, for reassurance. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the man who had stood beside his wife and said nothing while she spoke about my home, as if it were already hers. "So what happens now?" he asked again, his voice lower, more careful this time, and I let the question sit in the air for a second before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted him to hear the weight of it. "Now," I said, "we take our time." And Vanessa exhaled sharply, a sound she tried to mask but could not fully contain. "With all due respect, Margaret, time is exactly what we do not have," she said, her tone tightening, the controlled politeness beginning to crack at the edges. "There are taxes, maintenance costs, ongoing expenses. We cannot just let things sit indefinitely," and I turned my gaze to her, steady, unhurried, noticing how quickly she moved back to numbers, to logistics, to anything that made this feel like a transaction instead of what it truly was. "We managed those costs for decades," I replied. "We will manage them now," and she opened her mouth to respond, but Harrison spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "All financial obligations will remain covered as outlined in the estate structure until a formal review is completed," and that seemed to catch her off guard. Just enough for her to pause, to reassess, to realize that the ground beneath her was not as stable as she had assumed, and Daniel looked between us again, slower this time, more deliberate. "You knew about this," he said, his eyes settling on me, and I held his gaze without hesitation. "No," I answered honestly. "Your father chose not to tell me unless it became necessary." And there was something in that answer that landed differently than anything else I had said so far, because it was not strategic, it was not controlled, it was simply true, and I saw it register in his expression, the realization that even I had not been aware of what had been put in place, that this was not a move I had planned, but one his father had anticipated, and Vanessa shifted beside him, her posture tightening again. "This is being exaggerated," she said, her voice sharper now, less measured. "We were having a conversation, that is all. There was no disrespect," and I tilted my head slightly, not in disbelief, but in quiet acknowledgement of the distance between what she was saying and what had actually happened. "You chose your moment carefully," I said. "That much is clear," and her eyes narrowed just slightly, the first real sign of frustration breaking through her composure. "We chose to be efficient," she replied, emphasizing the word as if repetition could reinforce it, and I let a small pause follow before answering, allowing the contrast between our tones to speak louder than any raised voice. "And in doing so, you revealed exactly what your priorities are," I said, and this time, Daniel did not look away. He held my gaze, and for a brief moment, I saw something shift behind his eyes, something closer to recognition than denial, but it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by the tension of a man caught between what he had done and what he was beginning to understand. "We are not trying to take anything from you," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain, and I nodded slowly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply acknowledging the statement for what it was, an attempt to reshape what could not be undone. "Intent is not always measured by what we say," I replied, "but by when we choose to say it," and the words settled between us, not as an accusation, but as a fact, simple and clear, and Harrison stepped slightly forward again, his presence steady, anchoring the moment once more. "The next step is a formal meeting," he said. One where all parties are present and the full terms of the estate can be reviewed under the conditions now in effect, and Vanessa's grip on the folder loosened just a fraction, as if the certainty she had carried into this room was finally slipping, and Daniel nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acceptance, and I stood there, composed, still, no longer reacting, no longer absorbing, simply present in a space that had shifted in a way none of them had expected. And as I looked at them both, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not about proving anything. It was about allowing them to face what they had already shown, and that, I realized, was something no one could argue their way out of. The room did not return to normal after that, not in the way people expect when a conversation ends and everyone pretends things are fine again, because nothing about this was fine anymore, and I could feel it in the way people moved around us, slower now, more aware, as if something unspoken had settled into the space and no one quite knew how to step around it. And Vanessa was the first to recover. Of course she was, drawing in a careful breath and smoothing the front of her coat with practiced precision, as if control could be restored through small, deliberate movements. "Then we will schedule the meeting," she said, her voice measured again, but thinner now, less certain beneath the surface. "There is no need to make this more complicated than it already is." And I watched her closely, not for what she said, but for what she did not. The way her eyes flicked briefly toward the folder in her hands, the way her shoulders held just a fraction tighter than before, and I realized she was already adjusting, already searching for another way forward, another angle that would bring things back under her influence. "Complication is not the issue," I replied, my tone even. "Clarity is," and Daniel shifted beside her, his weight moving from one foot to the other, a small, restless motion that told me more than any words he might have offered. "Mom," he said, and the words sounded unfamiliar coming from him now, not wrong, but distant, like something he had not used in the way it was meant to be used for a long time. "No one is trying to hurt you." And I looked at him then, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man standing in front of me, and I noticed how carefully he chose his words, how deliberately he avoided certain ones, and I wondered if he understood that omission can speak just as loudly as anything said out loud. "I believe you," I said quietly, and his expression shifted slightly, caught between relief and confusion, because that was not the response he had expected. "But belief does not change what has already happened," I added, and that was when Vanessa stepped in again, unable to leave the space unfilled. "We are all emotional today," she said, her voice smoothing out as she leaned back into a tone that had served her well before, one that suggested reason, balance, control. Things might have come across differently than intended, and I let that settle for a moment, not dismissing it, not accepting it, simply allowing it to exist as it was, a reframing, a repositioning, an attempt to soften something that had already shown its true shape. "Intent is rarely misunderstood when timing is clear," I replied, and there was no sharpness in my voice, no accusation, just a quiet statement that did not invite debate, and Harrison glanced between us briefly before speaking again, his role unchanged, steady, precise. "The formal review will address all interpretations," he said. "Until then, no actions regarding the estate are to be taken," and that seemed to land more heavily than anything else, because it removed movement, it removed momentum, it removed the sense that things were already in progress, and Vanessa's fingers tightened again, not as noticeably as before, but enough for me to see it, enough to understand that what unsettled her most was not what had been said, but what could no longer be done, and Daniel nodded slowly, almost automatically, as if agreeing was easier than questioning something he no longer fully understood, and the space between us grew quieter again, but this time it was not filled with uncertainty. It was filled with recognition, with the slow realization that the direction of everything had shifted, and I felt no need to push further, no need to press the moment beyond what it already was, because this was not about forcing an outcome. It was about allowing it to unfold exactly as it had been set in motion long before today, and I glanced once more at the room around us, at the empty chairs, the fading arrangements, the remnants of a service that had begun with one purpose and ended with another, and I understood that whatever came next would not be decided here, not in this room, not in this moment, but in what followed, in the choices that would be made once there was no longer any room for assumption, and as I turned slightly toward the exit, I paused just long enough to let my gaze return to Daniel, holding it for a brief second, not with expectation, not with disappointment, but with something far more final, an understanding that did not need to be spoken, and then I looked away, because some things, once seen clearly, do not require anything more. The air outside the chapel felt colder than before, not because the temperature had changed, but because something inside me had, and as I stepped away from the doors, I could hear their voices behind me again, quieter now, more restrained, as if they understood that whatever control they believed they had was no longer certain, and I did not turn back, not immediately, because there was no need to rush, no need to chase what was already beginning to unravel on its own, and Harrison walked beside me in silence for a few steps before speaking. "The formal meeting can be arranged within the week," he said, his tone steady, practical, as if we were discussing something entirely ordinary, and I nodded slightly, absorbing the words without urgency. "That will be fine," I replied, and we reached the edge of the walkway where the cars were parked, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the pavement. And I paused there, just for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me again, and I realized how different this silence felt compared to earlier. It was no longer empty. It was filled with something else, something grounded, something that did not shift with other people's expectations. "He knew?" I said softly, not looking at Harrison, but not needing to. He knew this would happen, and Harrison did not answer right away. But when he did, his voice carried a kind of quiet certainty that did not need emphasis. "He understood people very well," he said, and I allowed myself a small breath, not heavy, not broken, just steady, because for the first time since this day had begun, I did not feel like I was reacting to anything. I felt like I was standing exactly where I was meant to be, and behind me, the chapel doors opened again, and I heard footsteps approaching, quicker this time, more deliberate, and I did not need to turn to. No, it was Vanessa. "Margaret," she called out, her voice controlled but edged with something she could not fully conceal, and I turned slowly, meeting her halfway between where I stood and the entrance. Daniel a step behind her, his expression more guarded than before. "We need to clarify something," she said, holding the folder in front of her like it still carried weight, like it still meant what she thought it did, and I waited, giving her the space to continue, because I had learned that people reveal more when they are not interrupted. "If there's a clause, as you say," she continued, choosing her words carefully now, "then we need to review the exact language, because assumptions can lead to unnecessary complications." And there it was again, the attempt to bring things back into a space she could control, into terms she could manage, into definitions she could reshape, and I felt no resistance to it. No need to counter it directly, because I understood now that control was not something taken in a single moment. It was something that shifted quietly when the foundation beneath it changed. "You will have the opportunity to review everything," I said calmly, in the proper setting, and Daniel stepped forward slightly, his gaze moving between us. "Mom, we are just trying to make sure everything is handled correctly," he said, and I looked at him, not unkindly, not harshly, just clearly. "Correctly does not begin with urgency," I replied. "It begins with respect." And that word seemed to land differently this time, not brushed aside, not redirected, but held in the space between us, and Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see the shift. The moment where calculation met resistance it could not easily bypass, and she adjusted her grip on the folder again, a small, repetitive motion that told me more than any argument could. "We will be prepared for the meeting," she said finally, her voice steady but no longer as certain as it had been before, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without engaging it further, because there was nothing left to say here, not in this moment, not in this place, and I turned back toward the car, feeling their eyes on me for a second longer before they faded, replaced by the quiet of the open space around me, and as I reached for the door handle, I paused just briefly, not because I needed to, but because I chose to, and I looked back one last time, not at Vanessa, not at the folder in her hands, but at Daniel, and in that brief glance, I saw something I had not seen earlier, not clarity, not understanding, but the beginning of it. The first small fracture in the certainty he had been standing on, and I knew then that whatever came next would not need to be Forced, because once doubt enters a foundation built on assumption, it does not leave easily, and as I opened the car door and stepped inside, I felt something settle into place, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something far more controlled than anything they had expected. The drive home felt longer than it should have, not because of the distance, but because of the quiet that filled every inch of the car, a quiet that no longer felt empty, but deliberate, as if it were giving me space to think without interruption, and I kept my hand steady on the wheel, my eyes on the road, the familiar streets passing by in a way that felt almost distant, like I was seeing them for the first time after years of moving through them without question, and when I turned onto our street, I slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this was the place where everything had been built, every decision, every sacrifice, every ordinary day that had once felt so simple and now carried a weight I had never fully understood before, and when I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged, quiet, waiting. And I sat there for a moment after turning off the engine, my hands still resting on the steering wheel, allowing myself one steady breath before stepping out. And as I walked to the front door, I noticed the oak tree Robert and I had planted all those years ago, its branches wider now, stronger, its roots deep in the ground in a way that could not be easily undone. And I reached for the door handle, the familiar weight of the key in my hand grounding me in something that felt certain, something that had not shifted, and when I stepped inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always had, but it did not feel empty, not in the way I had feared it would. It felt present, as if every room still held the echoes of the life we had built together, and I walked slowly through the hallway, my fingertips brushing lightly against the wall, the same path I had taken countless times before, and I stopped in the kitchen, looking at the counter where Robert used to set his coffee mug every morning, and I allowed myself to stand there for a few seconds, not breaking, not falling apart, just remembering, and then I moved on because there was something else now, something that required my attention, and I made my way to the study, the one room in the house where Robert had always kept things in order, where papers were filed neatly, where nothing was left to chance, and I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and for a moment, I simply stood there, taking in the quiet, the faint scent of wood and paper, the sense of control that had always defined this space, and I walked to his desk, my hand resting lightly on its surface before opening the top drawer, and there it was, exactly where it should be, a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting, and I held it for a second, feeling the weight of it, not physically, but in what it represented, because Robert had known, he had prepared, he had seen something I had chosen not to see, and now he had left me what I needed to understand it fully, and I opened the envelope slowly, unfolding the paper inside with steady hands, my eyes moving across the lines, each word confirming what Harrison had said, but also revealing something more, something deeper, because this was not just a legal provision, it was a message, clear and unmistakable, and as I read, I felt that same quiet clarity settle over me again, stronger now, more complete, and I lowered the paper slightly, my gaze lifting toward the window where the late afternoon light filtered in, and I realized that nothing about today had been accidental, not the timing, not the words, not the way everything had unfolded exactly as it had, because Robert had anticipated it, he had understood the possibility of it, and he had made sure that when the moment came, I would not be unprepared, and I folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the desk with a precision that matched his own, and I stood there for a moment longer, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but grounded in something that felt steady and unshakable, and I thought about Vanessa, about the way she had held that folder, about the certainty she had carried into that room, and I thought about Daniel, about the hesitation I had finally seen in his eyes, and I understood then that what came next would not require confrontation, it would not require raised voices or forced explanations, it would require patience, the same kind Robert had shown, the same kind that allows truth to reveal itself without interference, and I turned toward the door, my hand resting briefly on the handle before opening it, stepping back into the hallway with a sense of calm that did not need to be explained because some things, once understood, do not need to be proven, and as I walked toward the living room, The quiet of the house no longer felt like absence. It felt like control, like ownership, like something that had always been mine, whether anyone else chose to recognize it or not. And I knew, with a certainty that did not waver, that when the meeting came, when everything was placed on the table, when every assumption was stripped away, there would be no confusion left, no room for interpretation, only the truth, exactly as Robert had intended it to be seen.